Mongolia is an inhospitable treasure trove. It withholds the dusty, fossilized mysteries of ancient worlds. It was one of the first regions outside of Africa to embrace ancient human ancestors, and it has gone through so many alternating environmental changes that it's no wonder it wants to cover it all up. Its paleontological resources will surely never end as more research is done. As we travel to these dry wastelands, we come face to face with a mystery millions of years old, which patiently waited to be revealed by our species. A mystery that has yet to be totally demystified. A mystery that takes us back to the Cretaceous period and the swampy habitat of one of the weirdest theropod dinosaurs, Deinocheirus mirificus, the unusually terrible hand. Hey, while I have your attention, I have two other channels you should check out when you get a chance. Edge of Reality is where I talk about cryptids and the paranormal, anything that is creepy, crawly, and outside of the realm of science. Edge's World of Monsters is where I tackle basically anything fictitious, whether that be kaiju or dragons. Scientists have been trekking out to the dunes and rocks of the Mongolian Gobi Desert for nearly a century. Long before the dagger of European imperialism was driven into this region, the endemic visage of parrot-beaked fossils emerged from the surrounding rock due to the natural processes of erosion. It's a commonly held belief that these haggardly, shelf-skulled animals played a part in the myths of indigenous peoples and weary travelers alike. According to these ideas, the skulls were considered to be those of large bird-like predators of regal affinity and taste for gold, the proud and mighty griffin. Regardless of the truth behind these claims, the unflinching hammer and pick of nature have excavated the fossil remains of ancient beasts for millennia. It's thanks to nature's help that we can even find these traces of ancient life to begin with. But alas, it is also this process we can thank for the snail's pace destruction of fossils as the wind, sand, water, and plants chip them down to dust, bit by bit. The first official Western expedition to the parched vistas and sandstone cliffs was launched by the American Museum of Natural History of New York in the 1920s. Led by paleontologist and adventurer Roy Chapman Andrews, the physical embodiment of Victorian-era pluck, the expedition was beyond fruitful in uncovering the remains of dinosaurs which died 80 million years ago. Strapped to the backs of begrudging camels and inadequate Dodge vehicles, their finds included the skeletons of the small ceratopsian dinosaurs Protoceratops and Psittacosaurus, as well as the small but feisty Velociraptor, the hauntingly beautiful Oviraptor, and enough eggs to make hundreds of omelets were they not made of hard and edible minerals. Andrews' team were not the first and would never be the last. The human story. 20 years after the first expedition, another series of journeys into the wastes would be undertaken by Soviets from the USSR Academy of Sciences and Mongolians from the Committee of Scientific Affairs of the Mongolian People's Republic. Unfortunately for them, World War II broke out and put a stop to their plans.
Hands. Are we the baddies?
After the war, 3 expeditions were successfully undertaken in 1946, 48, and 49. The Soviet scientists surveyed the areas found by the American venture in the 1920s, as well as noted some new localities amongst the Nemegt Basin in southern Mongolia. This depression would become known for the breadth of organisms discovered, running the gauntlet from the simplest decomposers and plants to the largest dinosaurian tertiary consumers.
That is one big pile of shit.
The Soviets teamed up with the Chinese for more expeditions in 1959 and 1960. This set of expeditions covered the same ground as the last few, but recovered new taxa from Cretaceous and Tertiary aged layers of the Earth. Treasures of natural history are numerous in the Gobi. Despite the collections of Americans, Soviets, and Chinese, more remnants of lost worlds were forthcoming. A third set of expeditions, this time undertaken by the Polish and the Mongolians in 1963, 64, and 65, would bring back to their museums a set of fossils so bizarre, their mystery would remain one for 60 more years. Back in the 1960s, the Mongolian expeditions were composed mostly of men. No shock there. But among the ranks of the second expedition of 1964 were 2 women, and the 1965 expedition had 3. The 1965 expedition was led by Polish paleontologist Zofia Gilan-Jaworowska. Sofia's expertise was in Paleozoic invertebrates, especially the trilobites. Eventually, she switched her focus to Mesozoic mammals, and she never stopped her love of the sciences, and was noted for an extreme tenacity for excavation, research, and preparation. One anecdote tells of a summer expedition in the Gobi, the same one in which the best fossil ever found of a Protoceratops and Velociraptor in a death battle in which she ruptured her eardrum. She went back to Warsaw for surgery, and as soon as she was healed, back to the field she went. It was on the third 1965 Soviet-Mongolian expedition to Mongolia, led by Zofia, that she found a disturbingly large pair of arms of a creature that surely haunted the nightmares of the hooting duck-billed dinosaurs and the speedy ostrich dinosaurs of Cretaceous Nemegt Basin. A pair of terrible hands leading to a pair of extraordinarily strong arms and shoulders were excavated from the top of a hill made of sandstone, which crumbled between the scientist's fingers. The remains were coming out of a section of rock which had been designated the Nemegt Formation by past explorers. This formation of rock represents a span of millions of years from the late Cretaceous. Unfortunately, it's been incredibly difficult to date the Nemegt Formation. Radiometric dating is hard for this unit due to its composition and geometry, plus it seems as though it transitioned into and overlapped a little both physically and temporally with other geologic formations in the region like the Barun-Goyot and Dejokta formations. That said, different dating methods have been used by various researchers throughout the years to narrow in on better possible dates. Jadwiga Karczewska and Maria Ziembinska-Turowitzlo published a paper in 1983 using the fossils of green algae to get an Upper Cretaceous age for the unit. A 2023 paper used, quote, uranium-lead isotope trace elements and Y-screening analyses using laser ablation inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry on the apatite minerals found in Tarbosaurus teeth to maybe get a better idea of when they were laid down and started fossilizing. This analysis got a date of 66.7 plus or minus 2.5 million years for the upper part of the Nemegt Formation. Overall, many of the different techniques generally agree with the late Cretaceous age attributed to the rock unit from the presence of specific animal types alone. It's generally agreed upon to be the Maastrichtian age of the late Cretaceous, but this is far from definitive and more research may adjust the times. Predator with the largest arms. The fossils Zofia and her team uncovered from the sandstone over a period of 4 days included massive forearms, a complete shoulder girdle, 3 dorsal vertebrae, 5 ribs, and gastralia. The original paper described the find, authored by Hoska Asmolska and Eva Ronevich, considered the remains to belong to a creature of unimaginable ferocity. A flesh-eating powerhouse of a predator, the likes of which would frighten even the pluckiest of arrogant tyrannosaurs. Since the only bits and pieces they found were hands and arms, and since those hands were enough to make you shit bricks, they named it, quite appropriately, the magnificently terrible hand, what in Latin would be Deinocheirus mirificus. The image of a haunting predator without a face, without a body, no legs to hold its bulk, and no tail to maim enemies would troll the annals of Polish and Mongolian sciences for decades to come. Despite plenty of hypotheses for the countenance of the terrible hand, no one was able to definitively prove what the beast could be till more remains were extracted from the same sun-scorched lands of the Gobi Desert. The original paper considered the creature to be part of the clade Carnosauria. During this period in dinosaur science, the group Carnosauria was lumped into the larger group Megalosauroidea. The members of the Carnosauria club included nearly all forms of Mesozoic monsters: the dauntingly swift allosaurs, the hasty ornithomimosaurs, the OG megalosaurs, and of course the tenacious tyrannosaurs of the American West. Basically anything with big teeth, big heads, and scary claws were assumed to be card-carrying members of the Carnosaur Club. Deinocheirus was given one of these membership cards because of its large size and the thick-walled characteristics of its bones, being heavier and less hollow than other types of theropod dinosaurs. In 1971, American paleontologist John Ostrom, one of the first to vocally observe the connections between birds and dinosaurs, and in effect, one of the progenitors of the dinosaur renaissance, observed how the bones of Deinocheirus had similarities with ornithomimosaurs. Nothing more specific was determined, but it would turn out that Ostrom was right on the mark. Once enough forms of carnivorous theropod dinosaurs were uncovered throughout the rest of the 20th century, it became quite obvious all of the members of the Carnosaur Club had to split off to make their own clubs. The ornithomimosaurs got stuck with the Coelurosaur card, since they shared a lot of quirks with the tyrants, slothosaurs, parrot mimics, raptors, and birds. It is generally considered by most popular science communicators that Deinocheirus was always assumed to be a carnosaur. However, even in the very first paper, the crew of the Polish Mongolian expedition noticed a few telltale signs of the ostrich dinosaurs within the terrible hand, like the gracile nature of the forelimbs, as well as their length and proportions. The team, as well as Mongolian paleontologist Rinken Barsbold, suggested that it had a few similarities with another unusual theropod dinosaur known from extremely fragmentary remains from the same region and geologic time frame: Therizinosaurus. Therizinosaurus was thought to be a giant turtle when first discovered. Later on, it was suggested to be a carnosaur, like Deinocheirus, as they were two of the only theropod remains at the time represented by long, powerful arms and hands capped by wicked claws. The entire Slothosaur club went through a bunch of different upheavals throughout the mid-20th century until it began to reform what is recognized today as the pot-bellied, long-armed, long-clawed, turkey-necked herbivores of Eurasia and North America. Deinocheirus would remain far more mysterious than even Therizinosaurus, and for far longer. Slothosaur? Soviet paleontologist Anatoly Konstantinovich Rozdestvensky published a paper in 1970 on the different claws across the various families of Mesozoic reptiles to get a sense for how some were used. Arboreality in the fossil record is hard to prove. This is because very few examples exist in the fossil record of animals with a huge suite of anatomical traits that are only found in arboreal animals living today. In other words, there are a lot more fossil animals with only one or two traits that could be argued to belong to arboreal animals. Easily one of the most common traits in traditional discussions of arboreality in the fossil record is small body size. After all, if a critter is too big, it's gonna break any tree it tries to climb. That didn't stop Rozdestvensky from hypothesizing that the large arms and huge claws of the ostrich dinosaurs may have made them adept tree climbers. He cited the 1917 work of Henry Fairfield Osborn, in which he compared the anatomical structures in ornithomimosaur arms to those in sloth arms. According to Deinocheirus' 2000 coverage of this old, untranslated, and effectively impossible to acquire paper, Rozdestvensky figured that most of the large theropods he speculated to have arboreal-like traits were too large to actually climb and hang around in trees like sloths. Those dinosaurs being the allosaur-like Cheilontosaurus and the Therizinosaurids. However, he took his attention to the then bodiless Deinocheirus. With just big-ass arms to work with, Rozdestvensky could fill in the blanks with basically anything. So, he hypothesized a giant ornithomimosaur with big arms for hanging onto trees, but with a small body and short limbs to make the physiology make a little bit more sense. More evidence of this was supposedly that the palms of the Deinocheirus material were clearly forced in an inwards position, something called neutral hand position. This is the condition now considered near universal across all of Dinosauria, so it's no longer a unique feature. Remember, dinosaurs were clappers, not slappers. They lacked the special traits that would allow the wrist bones to twist around each other to supinate the hand upwards or pronate the hand downwards. When some dinosaur groups adapted to quadrupedal stances and huge weights, their hands had to twist as far as they could to create the closest thing a naturally neutral hand position could make. This is why sauropods and most ornithischian dinosaur forefeet aren't completely forward-facing, as in elephants and cows. They tend to bow out to the sides. Needless to say, but this interpretation of the terrible hand didn't last long. Deinocheirus sharper image. Between the years of 2006 and 2012, an overwhelming amount of evidence was uncovered that not only completely solves the 60-year mystery, but solves it in a most unexpected and frankly bizarre way no one could even imagine. A new team of researchers set out to find the original dig site of the Deinocheirus fossils in and around 2008. The team consisted of a joint venture of Korean and Mongolian scientists. They were rewarded with success in finding the original site and correct in their hunch that the old site held more clues to the mystery. 2012 saw publication of this discovery by Yongnam Lee, Phil Bell, and Phil Curry. It became immediately clear as to why the remains of the terrible hand were in such a shattered fashion, because the researchers found the feeding traces of an incredible predator of the region. Tarbosaurus scraped its teeth along the ribs, which lined the bottom of the stomach of the terrible hand.
I think I might just put a knife in it.
I think that's a really good idea.
See if it works. Oh yes, it goes in beautifully.
These ribs, called gastralia, helped provide extra support for the enormous guts of the dinosaurs, and also provided extra push for breathing. Despite the happenstance of rediscovering the original Deinocheirus dig site and finding more skeletal elements, the creature remained a relative mystery for a few more years. Mongolia has some of the richest fossil resources of any one region on Earth, which has helped to fuel a fossil black market in the area. Fossil poachers will make discoveries, but take only the most easily sellable parts of the animals they have found, like skulls, feet, and hands, leaving the rest of the skeletons vandalized and open to the elements, making the process of erosion all the easier. Sometimes, they will even destroy the rest of the skeleton and dig site so that no one else can collect and make money off their discovery. I wouldn't be surprised if this is sometimes done to hide their activities from the authorities as well. Back in 2009, during the trip to rediscover the first Deinocheirus site by the same Korean-Mongolian team, plus Phil Curry, the team was able to locate a new specimen of Deinocheirus, thanks to a bunch of notes that had been scribbled on some literally dirty Mongolian currency by fossil poachers. This string of clues led the team to a locality called Bugin Tsav, which had a whole Deinocheirus skeleton minus aforementioned head, feet, and hands. Thankfully though, an arm was still with the remaining specimen, which clued the team in on the identity of the new specimen as Deinocheirus. This confirmation also told the scientists that yet another Deinocheirus specimen had been known since 2006, but had been labeled as a Therizinosaur. A 2-for-1.
Maybe.
As luck would have it, in 2011, French fossil trader François Escuyer spotted a set of fossils, including a head, hands, and feet of a weird dinosaur in the private possession of a German fossil collector. Escuyer brought word of this to Belgian paleontologist Pascal Godefroy, who was well aware of what Phil Curry and friends were searching for in the deserts of Mongolia. So Godefroy got Curry in on this case. Escuyer bought the fossils, donated them to the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences, and the cadre of paleontologists all came together to officially confirm that what they had on their hands was not only new Deinocheirus material, but were technically the exact missing elements from the specimens they already had on their hands. In the end, the remains were all repatriated to Mongolia, where they belong, to the Central Museum of Mongolian Dinosaurs for further study. The mystery of Mongolia, an enigma spanning over 60 years, was finally solved, and boy, is it unlike anything anyone could have ever imagined. The scientists, now replete with 3 specimens of the terrible hand, 1 fractured and 2 complete, went to work trying to tell the story of the Frankensteinian creature. To resurrect the terrible hand and to tease out answers to its life history and connections with the world in which it lived, I must do as the discoverers did and take a gander at the bones. Here we go. Isn't that a truly bizarre skeleton? Almost looks like a chimera of different dinosaurs, right? The other weird part you probably aren't in the right perspective for is the size. Let's throw some skin on the bones real quick to see how big it was. Now that you have a good handle on the type of funky anatomy we're working with here, let's bring in Mr. Man from Animal Planet's
The Most Extreme
to show you how that anatomy stacked up to us puny apes. The 2014 paper estimated that the largest of the 2 specimens may have been as much as 11 meters, 36 feet in length, and pushed down on the ground with a weight of up to 7 tons when it was alive. Other researchers have come up with different length and weight estimates, but none have been different enough to mention. After all, sizes in and around the estimate for the big one are all plausible. It would be nearly impossible to have found the biggest possible individual of an extinct animal. Interestingly, Phil Center and James Robbins published a paper in 2010 trying to determine the height of the hips for Deinocheirus and Therizinosaurus based on the lengths of the forearm bones. To do this, the pair collected measurements for the humerus, radius, and metacarpal too for a bunch of dinosaurs from every group. They then got a hind limb length by adding all those lengths up, and then did some regressions and correlations with all that data. They found that there was a 90% or more correlation between forearm and hind limb length. Their quick maths popped out a hind limb length for Deinocheirus of 3,323.14 to 3,646.50 millimeters, or 130.8 to 143.5 inches. Back in 2010, this meant that Deinocheirus had the tallest hind limb of any theropod then known, having lots of implications for the ecology of the animal. Once the other 2 specimens were found and described in 2014, this figure turned out to be quite accurate. Oh, yeah, you don't need to still be here. Thanks, Mr. Man. The Beast Story. The terrible hand still retains the world record for the largest arms of any terrestrial biped to ever live, with lengths pushing 2.5 meters or 8 feet. These powerful forelimbs ended in gracile but powerful fingers and enormous recurved talons. Its body was adapted to hold an estimated 6-ton bulk, and that can be seen in the broad, thickened legs and feet which resemble the powerful legs of a carnivorous theropod dinosaur. The neck is long and topped by a skull with mixed features from various unaffiliated dinosaurian gangs. Its head is long and low, flattened from the top and bottom, like the wide, pulp-munching beaks of the hadrosaurs, except this skull lacked teeth. In 2014, Pascaline Lauters, Yongnam Lee, Rinken Barsboll, Phil Curry, Yoshitsugu Kobayashi, Francois Escuyer, and Pascal Godefroy published an abstract and presented it at the 2014 Society of Vertebrate Paleontology Conference in Berlin, in which they CT scanned the skull of Deinocheirus to get the dirt on its brain. The researchers found that the brain was similar in shape to birds and the smartest known non-bird dinos, the troodontids. It was large and globular. It was the biggest of brains. Globular brain! Big beautiful brain. A big beautiful brain, am I right, folks? Anyways, Its olfactory bulbs were large, but not as big as in other theropods, so its smeller was just aight. The brain itself, despite the smart shapes, was proportionally quite small compared to the massive size of the noggin and the critter that noggin controlled. Tyrannosaurs tend to have better reptile and civilization quotients to Deinocheirus, meaning they were potentially much smarter.
Maybe.
However, the REQ stuff is hard to fully qualify with regard to intelligence and the breadth of behaviors that might correspond to, so saying it means an animal is dumb or smart is outside of its purview. A good brain for a big bumbling omnivorous bear-like beast, but perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself. Now that a torso can be incorporated into the overall skeleton of the terrible hand, we shall see it was quite odd. The ribs bent upwards and then straight down and inwards, giving the animal a tall or deep look but without a lot of width. The highly pneumatic vertebrae held up neural spines, not unlike the rectangular blades of bone you'd find amongst the forgotten remains of a beached whale. The wide struts of the spine gave the terrible hand a hump-shaped sail. If we continue our journey down the animal's stony vertebral column, you'll find it had a long tail tipped by a short series of fused bones, more like something a bird carries in exchange for a tail, the pygostyle. Pygostyles act as a connection point or anchor for the quill part of a feather. In birds, this bone anchors the tail feathers used most commonly for changing direction in flight. What might a 6-ton, 11-meter animal need such a tail for, and how could there be something like this only at the very tip of a very long tail? These and other questions about the terrible hand have been raised by its rediscovery, and scientists are finding the answers to them, bit by bit. Deinocheirus is part of the Maniraptora group, a large smattering of theropod dinosaurs known for their extensive coverings of feathers, high intellect, and speed-adapted feet and legs. Most of the more bird-like dinosaurs in this group, including the birds themselves, all have this kind of fan at the end of their tails anchored into the pygostyle structure. The dromaeosaurs, or raptor dinosaurs, didn't have a pygostyle. Instead, they opted for long, tendon-like rods of bone that extended from the individual vertebrae of the tail to create a flexible rod onto which a huge fan of feathers running along the lateral edge of the tail were anchored. The only non-avian dinosaurs known to have a pygostyle, other than whatever is seen in Deinocheirus, are members of the crested, parrot-beaked maniraptorans known as the oviraptorosaurians, such as the super-primitive pheasant-like Caudipteryx and Similicodipteryx, or the frustratingly headless Nomingia. There is one example of a pygostyle-like structure in the primitive therizinosaur Bapiausaurus, though it is rod-like and a bit unlike those seen in my other examples. Therizinosauridia diverged from the Maniraptoran tree earlier than the Oviraptorosaurians, so perhaps the less developed pygostyle makes sense. However, the Ornithomimosaurians, to which Deinocheirus belongs, diverged before the entirety of the Maniraptora group, as it is a sister group to it within the greater Maniraptoriformes. This means that pygostyle-like structures are much more varied than being exclusive to only the most birdy of non-bird dinos. The evidence of a pygostyle in the terrible hand suggests that it too may have had a large vein of feathers at the end of the tail. Such a structure is commonly used by modern theropods for display purposes, and it likely served a similar function for the terrible hand. Now that its anatomy is known in full, what type of theropod is it? Over the decades, it has gone from the aforementioned Carnosaurian identity to a possible Ornithomimosaurian to a Therizinosaur, and now it's back to being an Ornithomimosaur.
I don't really want this.
However, an interesting position was taken in the 2004 edition of The Dinosauria by Peter Makovicki, Yoshitsugu Kobayashi, and Phil Curry. They figured that the available evidence suggested Deinocheirus was most likely a form of primitive Ornithomimosaur, as it seemed to have both Ornithomimosaur and non-Ornithomimosaur traits. But of course, that was when only the arms were known. With the 2014 paper and the 2 complete specimens, a whole suite of anatomical traits was able to be collected and turned into data to be compared and contrasted with the data from all other known ornithomimosaurs. This analysis found that Deinocheirus wasn't necessarily a primitive form, and actually was a member of its own unique group, which was named Deinocheiridae, a family which had been technically named all the way back when it was first described, but it never really had any use. This new family was also found to include the 1981 named Garudimimus, potentially the 1984 named Harpymimus, and the 2020 Paraxenosaurus. The description of the first and currently only known North American form of Deinocheirid-like ornithomimosaur, that being Paraxenosaurus, found that Deinocheirus and Garudimimus formed a polytomy with it. A polytomy is a grouping in which all members are equally likely to be related to one another, but it's too difficult to tell exactly the relationships between them. Back in 2014, the large Chinese Beishanlong was considered the oldest member of this group, but with Paraxenosaurus it got kicked out and replaced by Harpymimus, which is from early Cretaceous Mongolia. Considering the extremely fragmentary nature of Paraxenosaurus compared to Deinocheirus, this arrangement is most likely subject to change. But Deinocheirus probably isn't budging from its position as the biggest and baddest form of ostrich dinosaur that was shaped by its environment over time to be a sister group to the majority of all other known ornithomimosaurs. Being both an ornithomimosaur and a maniraptoran, Deinocheirus may have been covered in a coat of feathers. I admit my bias in appreciating the aesthetics of reconstructing a theropod dinosaur more like a bird than a reptile, as has been the case in recent years by fervent paleoartists of the anti-shrink wrapping persuasion.
This is the most obnoxious thing I've ever experienced in my life.
It has become increasingly difficult to determine whether the largest members of the feather-clad theropod lineages were also covered in feathers. The world was hot during the Mesozoic, and if you're a warm-blooded, high-metabolic animal of 3 tons or more in weight, feathers might be a hindrance and overheat the animal to death. Tyrannosaurus, Therizinosaurus, Deinocheirus, Gigantoraptor, or even Utahraptor hold the distinction in being some of the largest members of this group of featherheads. Though their bodies seem adapted to a covering of feathers, looking especially naked without them, some definitely were naked, and yet more wore jackets of thin primitive feathers with body-cooling properties. Deinocheirus, on the other hand, pun intended, could have had a coat of feathers covering its body, but to what extent is completely unknown. Considering it lived in a warm, humid region, a shorter coat seems right on the mark. But then again, paleoartist and paleontologist Mark Witten has done a whole blog post about theropod thermal dynamics and reconstructed his Deinocheirus with no feathers, aside from some sparse elephantine bristles. I likened the metabolism of Deinocheirus to that of a mammal, but how do I know that enough to tell you that? Well, at this point it should be generally assumed that the majority of dinosaurs operated under higher metabolisms than most reptiles. We went through the dinosaur renaissance explicitly for that reason. That said, however, some more recent research has tried to find some nuance. By that, I mean that some dinosaurs had faster or slower metabolisms. The group was so diverse and with so many body plans or physiologies that it would only make sense that some were hyperactive mammal-like animals, while others were more like leatherback sea turtles, able to keep their internal combustion engine going just off sheer body mass. After all, this is even seen across the mammals, with some being far more reptilian in their metabolisms, and others being so fast that they die if they skip a meal. For Deinocheirus specifically, paleontologists Martin Kundrat and Yongnam Lee published an abstract, presumably for a paper they have on the back burner, at the 13th annual meeting of the European Association of Vertebrate Paleontologists back in 2015, in which they recount their work looking at the insides of Deinocheirus bones. They sliced and diced some bones and put those slices under the microscope under different wavelengths of light. Those methods found that the types of bone and layers they were seeing proved that Deinocheirus most likely had a high metabolic rate and, like the tyrannosaurs, experienced a period of rapid growth as it reached sexual maturity, before slowing down. Too bad the full paper on this never got published. Until then, this has been all I can say on the matter. The holotype specimen seemed to have preserved paleopathologies, as outlined by Ashmolska and Ronevich in the original 1970 paper describing said specimen. They found that the finger bones had weird bits and grooves that were asymmetrical or otherwise not natural. They hypothesized that these were the result of some sort of injury to the hand that shifted the joints and ligaments a bit. Eventually, that shift became semi-permanent, and the tendons and ligaments shifted with it, resulting in a messed up hand. Similarly, the coracoid bones of the shoulder girdle are asymmetrical, and a rib was found with a healed break. Clearly, these critters did not shy away from combat. Good eating. The beak of the animal suggests it would have been an herbivore. The preservation of over 1,400 polished grinding stones, called gastroliths, in the chest cavity of one of the more complete specimens speaks volumes of this conclusion. The terrible hand would have used these gastroliths to grind up food that could not be broken down by its mouth. Possibly similar in fashion to the slothosaurs, Deinocheirus likely used its long arms and claws to great effect in obtaining its food, reaching up into the trees to pull down anything it wanted to its waiting maw. The thickness of the lower jaw leaves more than enough room for a giant tongue, which could have grasped foliage as it brought a smorgasbord to its face. The flat, blunt claws of the feet would have been used to keep the animal in place as it foraged. The spaces in the skull reserved for jaw muscles was relatively shallow, meaning it probably didn't have a super strong bite force, which strongly points to a lifestyle more akin to modern waterfowl. Instead of reaching up into the branches of magnolias and conifers, it may have used its reinforced legs and blunt foot claws to anchor itself deeply into the sand and mud of riverbanks and swamps. Haphazardly, it would use its hand scrapers to scoop large swaths of soft water plants into its mouth and mash them a bit before swallowing. A hint at what else the beast may have subdued resides with the grinding stones in the chest cavity. Fish bones and fish scales were found amongst the gastroliths. These fossils were not complete, fish skeleton and all, so they had to have been processed into smaller pieces before they reached this area of the dinosaur skeleton, which means they were probably eaten. The terrible hand was snacking on fish before it died. If it was wading through rivers and mashing up soft water plants, fish were definitely also on the menu. An omnivore it is. Crustaceous community. As the sun rises with a screaming cacophony of yellow and orange rays, a beast wakes from her slumber. As the lumbering omnivore rises from the wood and leaf mat she made for herself the night before, dust from the creatures of the night evacuates her hide in a cloud of obnoxious feathers, smelly dead skin, and acrid animal droppings. This morning she was awoken by the loud honking and shrieking emanating from the congregation of her species in the riverbank, for the wet season has swollen the waterways, choking them with bounties of fish and churned up vegetation. As she slowly makes her way to the river for breakfast, her joints creaking all the while, she notices other animals in her Mongolian community are stirring. It is 7 o'clock, and everyone is waking up to begin the day. Deinocheirus was found within a fruitful unit of rock known as the Nemegt Formation. I already noted its tentative date of Maastrichtian, a section of time known as the latest of late Cretaceous. During the time of the Terrible Hand, the Nemegt Basin was not a wasteland of dunes, sand, and rocky outcrops. The flaming cliffs did not yet exist, mountain ranges had not yet been crunched up by the movements of the continents, and camels were many millions of years from wandering the premises. At the time of Deinocheirus, this region was a mixture of different habitats. Evidence in the rock record suggests it was rather lush and vibrant. The rocks themselves are composed of shales and sandstones, which were in turn deposited by water sources comparable to lakes, streams, and floodplains, depending on the size of the sediments and speed of water flow. Some areas of the Nemegt Formation would have been flooded during the wet seasons, turned into swampy wetlands rife for colonization by flowering water lilies, mosses of all calibers, horsetails, and woody plants. Fossilized remains of the plant life of the Nemegt Formation include Araucarian trees with a high level of density, which created thickly wooded forests with high canopies, only reachable by sauropod dinosaurs. Neighbors of the Terrible Hand are numerous. Of course, there were the invertebrate and microbial cleanup crews of the soils and underbrush, the millipedes, termites, ants, isopods, cockroaches, centipedes, and bacteria that all helped to deconstruct and chew up anything left behind by larger animals to recycle the solar energy consumed by the macro world. Above them were many small mammals, fish, amphibians, and reptiles, such as the frog Altanulia, Erypaima hyrenaichthes, moon eyes, multituberculate Baginbatar, mysterious metatherians, turtles, Gobia ballone, gravimes, mongolames, mongolocheles, and nemectomes, the croc paralligator, and more. The Nemegt Formation is rife with theropod dinosaurs, and rather scant are the remains of anything else. This lack of diversity in non-theropod species may indicate why there were groups of animals taking any open niche available, like Deinocheirus. Deinocheirus had to watch their steps whenever they ventured into the dappled conifer forests for dromaeosaurs and troodontids like Adasaurus, Xenobazar, Tachysaurus, and Borogovia, which were active feathered creatures easily mistakable for ground-dwelling birds of today. The enantiornithine bird, Gurlinia, flitted from tree to tree, possibly in search of seeds and insects, or hitched a ride on a Deinocheirus hump to pick out any parasites. The Hesperornithines, Brodavis, and Judinornis were marine birds that used their powerful back legs to zoom through the shallows not far from the flooded wetland home of the Terrible Hand. Possible predators of these smaller creatures, or perhaps the ones which pillaged the cycads and flowering plants of their fruits, nuts, and seeds, were the Oviraptorosaurs. In the Nemegt, these parrot-beaked turkeys were represented by Rhynchenia, Oxaco, Nomingia, Numectomia, Gobiraptor, Elmisaurus, Conchoraptor, and Avimimus. They ranged in size from chicken to small emu and ranged greatly in diet, but were likely the major omnivores of the ecosystems. Walking coffee tables plowed through the swamps, looking like the Mesozoic equivalent of hippos as they trotted along the bottom. Cycenia and Tarchia were medium-sized herbivores with wide-set muzzles, poised for consuming any piece of vegetation in sight, while the titanosaurian sauropods Nemegtosaurus and Opisthocoelocardia shook the ground beneath their feet as they browsed on choice shoots and branches of the upper canopy. In the air squawked the calls of giraffe-sized Ashtarchids, and an as-yet unknown cornucopia of pterosaurs and birds. Hunting down the Terrible Hand were the likes of the Tyrannosaurs, Alioramus, and Tarbosaurus, for which direct evidence of feeding behavior of the latter exists in the remains of the Terrible Hand. Tarbosaurus was a 10-meter, 5-ton, lighter-built cousin to Tyrannosaurus and would have offered Deinocheirus pretty much the only major threat at the time. Sure, the demon dunk wouldn't want to piss off a sauropod, no one would, but for all intents and purposes, it was relatively off-limits to everything but Tarbosaurus. Phil Bell, Phil Curry, and Yongnam Lee published a brief report on the tooth marks they found etched onto the rib bones of Deinocheirus in a 2012 issue of Cretaceous Research. The Korea-Mongolia International Dinosaur Project was a huge multicultural effort to increase the understanding of Mongolian dinosaurs. It ran for many years and included paleontologists from all over the world, not just Mongolia and Korea, such as the Canadian ankylosaur expert Victoria Arbour. In 2008, part of the team set out with the intention of rediscovering the original dig site that produced the holotype specimen of Deinocheirus. This was for a few reasons, mainly to scour the exposed rocks for any uncollected fossils still in situ, and also to search through the spoil piles for as many tiny bits and bobs as they could find. At the time, the holotype arms were the one and only thing for Deinocheirus, so even comparatively useless chips and bits could potentially contain some interesting information on the animal. The Korea-Mongolia International Dinosaur Project team was successful in relocating the dig site. They were able to collect hundreds of bits, plus many nearly complete gastralia. Reminder, gastralia were thin ribs that rested within the belly muscles of archosaurs. They helped them breathe, among other things. Once they started looking closely at all these seemingly boring curved bones, they could see something super interesting: bite marks. Specifically, the team found bite marks on 2 bone fragments. Like with most things in science, there is a classification scheme for fossil bite marks. Darren Tank and Phil Curry were the ones to come up with these classification schemes and definitions: punctures, gouges, scores, tooth drag marks, small-scale parallel striae, embedded teeth, or combinations of any of these. The ribs preserved some of the rarest forms of tooth mark, parallel striae. These marks are made when an animal drags the tooth along the bone and will allow the identification of the mark maker, usually down to the group. That is, depending on what group we're talking about here, since some dinosaurs had more generic teeth, while others, such as tyrannosaurs, had incredibly unique teeth. The pattern left on the bones, according to the authors, could only have been left by a member of the Tyrannosauroidea. In this case, it could only have been Tarbosaurus. Well, that we know of course, since other large tyrannosaurs may have been present in late Cretaceous Mongolia, and there just hasn't been any evidence found of them yet. Tarbosaurus is the largest tyrannosaur in the region at the time, so it best matches as the mark maker. Though Aliramus was also around at the same time and place, it was a lot smaller and had smaller teeth, so it may or may not be a candidate for the mark maker. As it stands, one cannot technically ID the mark maker without a shadow of a doubt, since there are no teeth or bone from a Tarbosaurus in the site to confirm anything. Another thing that makes this discovery important is that theropod tooth marks left on theropod bones is extremely rare in the fossil record, accounting for about 2% of all theropod tooth marks found in the fossil record as of 2001. These marks also preserve an important instance of behavior and ecology. It proves that tyrannosaurs in the time and place were more than happy to snack on the giant Deinocheirus. It does not prove, however, whether the tyrannosaur killed the Deinocheirus or scavenged it. What the whole dig site does show is that the tyrannosaur went straight for the gut and tore out everything it wanted from there. This is further backed up by the fact that no tooth marks were reported from the characteristic arms and shoulders, only on these belly ribs. But Deinocheirus was not the only super tall, beaked, well-armed theropod in the area. Therizinosaurus was another terrible-handed contemporary of Deinocheirus, which was probably more on the herbivorous side, using its long, scythe-like claws to bring bushes of foliage towards its tiny head. The one-clawed Mononychus and Nemectonychus, plus the elephant-sized Gallimimus and its smaller relative Anserimimus, could outrun most of the predators of the ecosystem and used this to their advantage to snag plants and animals as they pleased. This Cretaceous scene would not be complete without the banter of hadrosaurs, here represented by Barsboldia and Saurolophus. They were accompanied by the small pachycephalosaurs, Homalocephali and Prenocephali. Deinocheirus through the decades. Thanks to the incredibly long-running mystery of this dinosaur genus, you get 3 or 4 generalized versions of the animal. The original look for the critter was the giant Carnosaur, essentially Megaraptorans before anyone knew what a Megaraptoran was. This version didn't stay in the literature for long, but it totally captured the imaginations of paleoartists for way too long. The oldest readily available Carnosaurian depiction of the terrible hand is this one by Thomas Thymier from the 1980s. As you can see, it almost looks more like the old-fashioned look for Deinocheirus, popularized by Bob Bacher. It's just missing the killer foot talons and the ballerina poses. Just look at that blocky head. The beast is totally ready for rending flesh. The next super old Deinocheirus depiction is perhaps the most, creative? In 1989, Pam Mara illustrated her Deinocheirus as disembodied hands and arms, just like the fossils. In this way, she avoided her art ever really becoming outdated. People should do more of this these days, in my opinion. After these are two from 1993. This one is by Ruben Artyomovich Varshomov and recreates the creature as a huge, lumbering, alligator lizard-like beast with beaded armored scales and an almost herbivorous lizard snout. This Deinocheirus likes long walks on the beach and watching the sunset. The other one took the idea of an oversized Deinocheirus too literally. In fact, by the looks of it, that 1980 piece may have been a huge reference. Barba Kiskova made this piece in 1993, depicting a supersized dromaeosaurian version of the terrible hand, replete with normal-sized arms and grasping raptor paws, plus gracile running legs ending in the talons these wretched whelps obviously used to disembowel hapless ornithopods with kicks they definitely were able to make. Recall that even in the original paper that described Deinocheirus, the possible identity of Ornithomimosaur was floated. As this identification solidified as the more probable one, Paleoart started to force Deinocheirus out of the Carnosaur box and into the ostrich mimic box. Since most Ornithomimosaurs known from the 80s to the 90s were generally very similar in appearance, and since feathered Maniraptorans were a decade or so out, people were treated to a parade of giant ostrich dino Deinocheiruses. You've got James Gurney's Dinotopian ostrich racers. Then you have Louis Ray's Therizinosaurian copycat. Just look at those summer bomb or rocket pop colors. Bring back unnaturally neon-colored dinosaurs, damn it! How about these two from encyclopedic books from the 90s and the aughts? The Jurassic Park Institute's brightly striped version by Timothy Bradley here gives its best impression of a prize fighter. James Field is a largely overlooked, and in my opinion, underrated paleoartist that did a lot of stuff for kids' books from the 90s to the aughts. I have a lot of memories of seeing his work in books at my local libraries. That's why his Deinocheirus is probably one of my favorites. Look at it. He got the anatomy spot on, at least with those arms. Plus, he even gave it some feathers. I'm sure there are other forms of outdated Deinocheirus paleoart pieces out there lurking in obscure books very few come across, but I have to move on. The next form of Deinocheirus came when rumors of the discovery of new specimens were spread throughout the various paleontological conferences and online spaces in the early 2010s. At the time, things were vague, so a bunch of art was created that shows essentially the same giant Ornithomimosaur as earlier decades, this time with a hump or sail over the hips. Ashir Elbeen, Siri Thomas, Morrison Mauricio, Joshua Canupa, Vitor Silva, and so many more were quick to come up with some hypothetical looks at the new Deinocheirus before things really blew up in 2014. Once everything was officially published, the lovable bear-like spoonbill-headed oaf you all know and love was confirmed. Though the terrible hand was excavated nearly 60 years ago, its remains have tantalized and taunted any researcher who has learned of the story. What was once assumed to be a common killer amongst the tussling Triceratops and scuba-diving hadrosaurs took on a life of its own and underwent a facelift as yet unheard of among the dinosaurs. Deinocheirus was one of the most interesting theropod dinosaurs. A spoon-faced, sloth-armed, camel-humped behemoth with a taste for fish and a mouth for moss. It was the largest form an ostrich dinosaur could take, and met its end by the teeth of a tyrannosaur. A life lived, and a life lost, but the remains of which went on to compose the bodies and energies of countless other life forms. What other bizarre mysteries lay hidden amongst the sands of the Gobi Desert? For more interesting stories about nature, the history of life, or what goes bump in the night, subscribe, like this video, drop a comment in the comment section below, and hit the bell icon to stay in the know with everything Edge. Thanks for watching.